Hi there, welcome back to Paris for another one of our live discussions. Probabilistic forecasts are used from everything from predicting the next day's weather to generating betting odds on your favourite sporting events. Today on LokadTV, we're going to be discussing exactly what probabilistic forecasts are, why they can be beneficial, and also how they can be implemented into businesses to improve the way that they operate. So Johannes, definitely a subject that's of interest at the moment with so many sports fans and bookmakers sort of trying to work out who's exactly going to win the World Cup. But perhaps a good place to start is, what are probabilistic forecasts?
Probabilistic forecasts represent a class of forecasts when you have imperfect information about the future. So you have a sense of what are the probable futures, the futures that have a chance of happening, versus the futures that do not have a chance of happening. And typically when people think a forecast, they think like if it was completely final, like a team of this country is going to win, period. I know it. But the point is that you don't know for sure. You know, it's just a certain probability that this team is going to win. So a more accurate forecast is to actually say, have this short list of teams that are very strong and that have collectively a very high probability of winning. It's not as satisfying as knowing the winner, but nobody can ever know the winner. There is so much uncertainty at stake, but it's probably the most accurate form of forecasting. So probabilistic forecasting is about making a statement about the future that involve probabilities, where you say you have plenty of outcomes that have a certain probability of happening, and you just assess that. And it embraces the very notion that you don't know everything about the future and you don't pretend to know. And so they are not exactly more accurate in the sense that you can spot exactly who is going to the World Cup, but you can make a statement that will be that will have a much greater chance of being actually relevant if you want to actually take a decision, such as to bet on one team or a mix of team, as opposed to go all in on just one team.
Okay, so what's the main sort of benefit to this? What is the benefit when compared to sort of more traditional forecasting techniques?
That's the primary benefit is that probabilistic forecast gives you an angle to approach all the asymmetries that you have in supply chain, if we bring it back to supply chain.
So what do you mean by all the asymmetries?
So the asymmetries are the fact that the costs are on the fact that you overestimate or underestimate, let's say, demand, are not exactly symmetrical. For example, let's take aerospace. If you overestimate your demand, you might have in stock one screw that you never use. So this screw might be, let's say, €50. And on the other hand, if you underestimate your need for screws, then you can have an aircraft that is grounded, so it cannot take off and take passengers, etc., just because it's one screw short, and that costs you hundreds of thousands of euros of delays, of passengers that you have to reroute and everything. So you see, it's highly asymmetrical. The cost of having one unit too much versus one unit too short are radically different. And the problem with the classic forecast, you know, the forecast where you say, this is it, is that typically you're shooting for the average. You say, well, on average, I think that the future will be around there. So I will have X unit of demand and this is it. But the problem is that in supply chain, it's not necessarily the average that you want to secure. It's typically your costs are much more driven by the extreme, because when you have way too few, you finally get stuck out, so you cannot service your clients, and that can lead to a situation where it costs you a lot of money, as illustrated by aerospace. But if you have too much inventory, and let's say, for example, you're in food retail and you have perishable inventory, if you have too much, at some point you need to discard your inventory, so you lose it entirely.
And so if we talk about these sort of extremes, they're basically sort of boundaries, aren't they, to our problem? So how can we establish where those boundaries are?
But that's the trick, is that they are actually elusive boundaries. It's again, it's a matter of probability. So things can happen. Extreme events can happen with decreasing probability with respect of the degree of, I would say, of their extreme levels. So for example, if usually you have in a store a demand of, let's say, 5 units a day for a given product, then you might have a 5% chance of observing on any given day 10 units being, asked for, and maybe 1% chance of having 20 units being asked for, and maybe a 0.0% chance of having 50 units being asked for the same product on any given day. So you see, it's there is no final boundary. It's a continuum of events that becomes rarer and rarer, and you can assess the probabilities of that.
But in this continuum of events, you're basically saying that you're predicting every single possibility. I mean, surely you've got to draw the line somewhere. I mean, you can't know exactly what's going to happen tomorrow. If you're having products that are delivered to you, for example, a probability might be that the ship they're coming on might sink. So can you really use every single possible future? Is that
so indeed,
realistic?
there is a mathematical. I mean, first, indeed, because we have computers, and computers have finite amount of memory and computation cycles and everything, you have to restrict the number of futures that you assess to a finite number. But what is surprising is that computers have tremendous computing resources. So even if the number of futures they can assess is finite, it can be still extremely large. Meaning that, for example, for a product that you usually sell only a few units a day in a store, you can still cheaply assess the probability of selling 1,000 units, even if it's not even a chance of 1,000,000. So, and same for the fact that, for example, you have a ship that is going to sink. It's maybe something like one chance, again, out of 1,000,000, but a computer can do billions of computations per second. So again, indeed, you can have mathematical models that assess, I would say, a whole variety of risk. I mean, you would probably not take into account the risk of having your ship that is at the bottom of the ocean, but you can assess the risk that, for example, the ship is detained more or less indefinitely at the customs. That can happen, and then you have a 3-month delay because you had the problems at the custom, and indeed you have a very, very long delay, which is pretty much as if as far as your shipment is concerned, as if the ship was at the bottom of the ocean. The season will be well finished by the time that you receive your swimming suits. It will be winter, and it's lost.
Yeah, maybe the ship at the bottom of the ocean was probably an extreme example.
Yes.
So let's probably talk now about those sort of mathematical models. How do we know which one's best to use? I mean, from the way I understand it, there's different forecasting techniques. Which are the mathematical models we're actually using?
So first, indeed, you need a mathematical model that generates distributions of probabilities. So it's very different from the sort of models that you can play with in Excel. Because when people think of forecasting, they intuitively think of some kind of moving average. You see, whenever you want to forecast the demand, they would say, oh, what was the demand last week, last year? They would kind of average the relevant time period, and they would end up with a forecast. It's not a bad way, by the way, of producing a forecast, but it produces a single point estimate. So basically, you've averaged your past, and that gives you an estimate for the future, and this is it. So now, first, when you want to move toward the probabilistic world, you need something that generates a whole distribution of probabilities. So here you have a variety of mathematical models. Let's say the most famous one is a Poisson model. If you want to be really fancy, you can have a look at negative binomial. So that's different classes of parametric models. You can even have non-parametric models. So that's I would say more sophisticated mathematical model that can produce all those probabilities that you want to generate. But then, as you correctly point out, this is not the end, because there you face a situation that is intriguing. No matter what happened, in the future, your model will say, well, I told you so. It's 10 units of demand. I told you so. There was a non-zero probability on 10 units. If you observe 100 units, same thing. The model would say, well, there was a probability for this to happen. And so the question is, how do you know if you're good or not, knowing that no matter what you observed, ultimately, the model will always told you so, there was a probability for this event to happen. So you also need a better class of metrics. I mean, metrics that are suitable for probabilistic forecast. And intuitively, if your model assigns a high probability that to an event that ultimately come to be observed, then your model is better. So basically, if I say that tomorrow Italy should win the World Cup with, let's say, 80% chance, and it turned out that it's not the case, then the model was probably quite inaccurate. If I said that Italy has originally 5% chance of winning the World Cup, well, it doesn't win the World Cup in the end, it was a reasonably accurate statement to produce. So those metrics are going to measure, how much weight are you putting in terms of probability toward things that are actually happening.
So if we talk about accuracy, because it's an interesting sort of word you use there, how does the accuracy of a probabilistic forecast kind of compare to a traditional forecast? Because it's like you're looking at very different things, right?
Exactly. And a probabilistic forecast is not, by design more accurate than a classic forecast. By the way, if you produce, a distribution of probabilities, you can always collapse your probabilistic forecast to a classic forecast by just taking the average of your distribution. But the problem is that when you do that, when you collapse a probabilistic forecast to a classical forecast, is that you lose all the information that you had on the tails, the events that were either where the demand would be either surprisingly low or surprisingly high. So indeed, you can measure the accuracy of a probabilistic forecast according to a very classical metric like mean absolute percentage error, but it doesn't really make sense because the whole insight is to capture more information about surprising events. And that's where you really find the very notion of accuracy. It's not just the average that is of interest. You want your forecast to be accurate where it really matters financially. And where in supply chain, where it really matters financially is not the average situation. Because you see, when your forecast is pretty much aligned with the reality, your inventory rotates just fine. If you're 20% higher, 20% lower, inventory rotates just fine. You're within your safety stock limits. So in terms of cost, the overhead is very limited. But it's when you start reaching, the non-linearities, which can be stockouts or the fact that your inventory is perishable and that you have to discard it, and then you have inventory write-off, that's the point where it becomes suddenly radically more expensive, and it's not a linear behavior at all. But in order to be able to reflect that, you need these forecasts that spread everywhere, looking at tons of possible futures, not just the average. So that's where your extra accuracy comes from. It's from the fact that you apprehend the future with more dimensions, with more depth in a way.
Okay, so you'd say sort of the main benefit is that you're looking at a wider picture and your sort of forecasts are a lot more enriched. So if we look at sort of the industry now, a lot of people are still using classic forecasting techniques. They're still kind of working. So why are people still so happy to use these techniques?
First, I'm not 1% sure they're happy to use those techniques, but the reality is in most supply chains, people are still using Excel. And most of the time, within Excel, you cannot conveniently produce probabilistic forecasts. It's possible to produce some probabilistic forecasts, but it's nowhere near as convenient. Again, producing a classic forecast is just about building some kind of moving average recipe, and then you're good. So first, whenever you want to move toward the probabilistic world, you have to give up on Excel, and you have to give up on Excel twice. First, you have to give up on Excel in the idea that you will generate the forecast in Excel. And then you have to give up on Excel a second time with the idea that you are going to generate a decision in Excel as well. Why? Because your decision is going to be like an exploration of all the possible futures. So you're going to assess all possible decisions and reflect all possible decisions against all possible futures to assess what is the economic outcome for every single decision so that you can directly pick the best decision, looking at all the possible outcomes. So suddenly you see you had like large number of futures to be considered, large number of decisions to be assessed against large number of futures. It becomes computationally a lot more intensive and largely incompatible to Excel. So if I get back to why aren't people doing that, is mostly because they need classes or tools that are not accessible to them at the present time. And again, they move toward Excel not because they liked it. It's because their ERP failed at delivering the sort of sophisticated risk analysis that they were needing to actually generate sane decisions for the supply chain.
Okay, so if we talk about those industries, which of those industries kind of does probabilistic forecasting work best in? Where are you seeing sort of the best results for a probabilistic forecast?
So the probabilistic forecasts really shine when there is uncertainty. When you know the future, you don't care. For example, if you want to produce, let's say, electricity consumption forecasts at nationwide scale, it's something that can be produced with a very, very high degree of precision. You can have like 0.5% inaccurate forecast if you want to forecast the electricity consumption of France per 1 hour time slot, up to probably 48 hours in advance. But those are the situations where you almost know perfectly the future. Same thing if you want to forecast how much traffic you will get on the roads, you can have very accurate forecasts. It's super highly predictable. But if you move toward domains where uncertainty is greater, so let's review where do you have a lot of uncertainty? Well, it's very easy. That's the usual suspects. Fashion, like the trends are super erratic. Fashion has pretty much like a lot of irreducible uncertainty. That will be aerospace and maintenance in general. It's not that aircraft are uncertain, it's just that you have many, many parts that have rare events where you need to maintain literally hundreds of thousands of parts, but they are needed very infrequently. So your uncertainty is you do not know when you're going to need a part, and you have so many parts, so many aircraft that it's not like selling bottle of milk in an hypermarket where you're selling like hundreds of units every single day. It's much more erratic. Then you would have also e-commerce in general, just because the long tail is actually super long. And so most of your sales comes from, I would say, from products that have intermittent erratic sales. And again, I would say probably as part of also everything that happened at the point of sale, at the store level. Again, because it's not the law of large numbers. It's most if you look at what is happening in the store, even if it's an hypermarket, even in a hypermarket that can have up to 100,000 references, you will only have, I would say in Europe, something like 2,000 products where you're going to sell 5 units or more every single day, and all the rest of the products, it's going to be less than 5 units a day. So it's very small numbers, and so the erraticity is large. And thus, probabilistic forecasts shine because they give you insight on the risks that you have for the inventory decisions that you take. So bottom line, probabilistic forecasts shine whenever you have a lot of uncertainty and you need to optimize your decisions against factoring all the risks that you have on one end of the spectrum. Have surprisingly low demand, and the other end of the spectrum surprisingly high demand.
Okay, so we've spoken a lot about the benefits of probabilistic forecasting. We've spoke about where it works well. How about those industries where it's not quite so appropriate to use it? Are there industries which actually classic forecasting is fine?
Yes, I mean, for example, if you are, I don't know, let's say you're producing cement, and you have clients that gives you, you have a backlog of orders for the next 3 years, then you don't need forecasts. If you know the future, it can happen also for some production, long-lived production lines in the automotive industry where you know that 12 months ahead, you know exactly what you're going to produce because let's say it's a large car maker that gives you a roadmap that is very precise, that can only diverge from max 5%. You see, if there is no residual uncertainty left about your plans, and it's just a matter of pure execution, then indeed, probabilistic forecast is not going to help you. So probabilistic forecast is only going to help you if there is some kind of erraticity, if you cannot know the future perfectly. If you already have like your roadmap that is like frozen for the next 12 months, then basically you do not care about probabilistic forecast.
Okay. And also, like, why are companies starting to use probabilistic forecasts now? I mean, it's not an especially new technology, if I'm right. So why is now the time that they're starting to see it used in industry a bit more commonly?
There is probably several reasons. First, it's a lot more computationally intensive. So you end up with models, statistical models that consumes anywhere like 100 times to 1,000 more computational power. The good news is processing power has never been so cheap. So actually, it's very rarely the bottleneck. But still, it means that a decade ago, most of those probabilistic calculations were, I would say, dramatically expensive. So you see, it's very different to be able to run your supply chain on a 2,000 euro budget a month of processing power or 2 million euro a month of processing power. It makes quite a difference in practice. That's what 3 orders of magnitude means in terms of cost. So clearly, the fact that processing power is much cheaper has helped a lot to make those methods a lot more practical. Then the second thing is also there is an entire class of statistical methods known as deep learning. That's where this AI, artificial intelligence buzzword comes from. It's all about this deep learning theory, and deep learning is all about probabilistic forecasting underneath. So it's not necessarily expressed as probabilistic forecast. I mean, maybe you don't care. Maybe you're just going to enjoy the fact that you have a piece of software that do voice recognition for you, and you don't really care that it's like a probabilistic calculation taking place under the hood, but actually this is what is happening. So deep learning is entirely driven by probabilistic modeling. So the fact, and this theory has enjoyed tremendous operational success. So you see, first we had more processing power, then we had mathematical theories that came out on top in terms of I would say, AI benchmarks when it comes to outcompete players. The world champion in Go, again, it's a probabilistic method that was used. It's not a combinatorial method.
Okay, so it sounds like probabilistic forecasting is very much like the thing of the now. But what about the future? I mean, how do you sort of see the next steps for probabilistic forecasting? Can you see it lasting very long, or how do you see that?
Yes, I mean, I think that the cat is out of the box. It will not come back to the box. So we'll probably not revert back to classical forecast. Again, once you have a probabilistic forecast, you know a lot more about the future. So it would be very weird to revert back to an approach that was fundamentally giving you much less information about the future. Now, even if you say we want to explore all possible futures, in practice we don't explore all possibilities. For example, we can say I have a probability of selling 0 units, 1 unit, 2 units, 3 units of this product, and I can make similar analysis for another product. But what about the joint probability for those 2 products together? You see, so suddenly, I had to estimate maybe 100 scenarios to have like all the demand scenario for my product A. I have to assess 100 scenarios for all the demand scenario for product B. But what about looking at all the scenarios for product A and B together? So that's like 100 times 100, 10,000 scenarios to look at. And if I had a third product with 100 scenarios, that would be 1 million scenarios to look at. And it grows exponentially as you add items. So the situation becomes rapidly, dramatically more complicated if you want to express all the probabilities explicitly. So I think what we will see more and more in the future are methods that do not even reify those probabilities. So you don't even try to compute all the probabilities for all the things that can happen. You have a methods that actually do those probabilistic calculation without the probabilities. It's kind of super weird, but by the way, this is exactly what deep learning and those AI techniques are about. They compute probabilities, but not necessarily expressing everything as a probability. And the big bonus is that suddenly you can explore scenarios about the future that are extremely complicated, and where it looks like you think of an absurdly large number of futures that would vastly exceed, the capacity of any reasonable computer or even a fleet of computers. But with, I would say, very smart mathematical tricks, you can still explore all those futures. And the trick will be that it's the essence of deep learning is that you will not try to explore those futures randomly. You want to zoom in on the futures that are most likely relevant for the forecast. So you want to zoom in the areas that are, I would say, relatively dense, where you have a fair chance of being a future of interest as opposed to randomly, trying to explore everything. And that will unlock tons of scenarios. For example, one of the things that we will try to explore probably this year will be to explore not only all the possible demand level for our products, but also look at all the possible horizon in time. So you want, a forecast for the demand that can start at any point of time, that can even be random, and ends at any point of time, again, random. So this is a way, for example, to reflect a scenario where you have a shipment that will land, but with uncertainty. It's coming through, let's say, a ship, and you have an uncertain lead time, so you do not know exactly when the product will start being available for sale in your store, online or offline. And you want to take this uncertainty into account when you figure out all your plans for the evolution of your inventory. So you need to take into account the fact that you have uncertainty on when the goods will be received, and when the demand will actually start, and when it will actually end. And if you want to even look further, it would be very interesting to start exploring, that's part of our, I would say, long-term roadmap, to even start exploring what-if scenarios on if you start to express what are all the possible futures if you consider all the pricing adjustment that you can make on your products. So you want to see what is all the possible future for demand if you let your prices as they are, and what if you start exploring all the possibilities for all the price adjustment that you can add on top. And when you start thinking of all those possible futures, the numbers becomes extremely large. So the trick is that you do not want to try to iterate individually over all those futures. You want to have some kind of mathematical techniques that let you explore all those futures, or a lot of them, but without trying to enumerate them.
Okay. Well, it sounds like there's so many possibilities. I'm glad it's left computers, because otherwise my brain's going to probably explode. But yeah, we're going to have to leave it there for today. But thanks for taking the time out to tell us all about probabilistic forecasting. It's been really interesting.
Thank you.
So that's all for today's episode. We'll be back again next week. But until then, make sure you're subscribed to our videos, and we'll see you again soon. Bye for now.